We are living in a polarizing world and an increasing geopolitical tension and a trend towards deglobalization. However, we must act now. Climate change doesn't wait for us to get our act together. And we need to remember that the green transition, is a long-term goal and should not be influenced by current geopolitical tensions over here.
Cal, just tell us, from your perspective at Hitachi, the politics of climate, how is the green transition going to play out in this era?
I would say that absolutely we see the momentum, we see the attention, we see the movement that is currently taking place. Geopolitics absolutely is going to play out significantly into this. The competition over the raw material, which is very important in this transition. The trade tension, which is currently going on, is also part of this discussion. So there are lots of things that we see, but to your point, I don't think that the momentum that currently is taking place is going to be stopped because of any change.
I think it's very, very important to keep in mind that we can't separate geopolitics from climate change. It's how we work together will define how effectively we'll be able to address the climate crisis. It will have impacts, whether we'll have access to the resources, the know-how, the solutions that we need for the green transition. But then at the same time, what happens with climate change will have and is increasingly having enormous impacts on geopolitics. And we know that these tensions will continue to rise.
Now, Vamsi, as an investor from JP Morgan, what are your headlines on the politics of climate and how it's all playing out?
Countries are simultaneously trying to decarbonize while trying to maintain energy security and energy affordability. And a lot of policies need to solve for all of these things for them to have a good buy-in from the society. They cannot sort of single-handedly pursue one angle. As we see that if costs go up, the support for decarbonization might come down, and that is the challenge when countries are making these policies.
From your perspective at Hitachi, what do you see as the biggest global headwinds impeding the green transition?
Global cooperation is necessary to achieve the 2015 goals. So currently, yes, there are trade policies, there are incentives to have more local capacity, but those are all considered short-term goals. They have to be part of a long-term strategy. And the strategy is clear. We have to resolve the global tension about trade. It has to be part of the solution. You cannot only build capacity and depend on resources that are built in the country, because that is against globalization that will delay achieving the goals.
I have to be a realist. I think that we certainly have always had and will continue to have countries looking into what is in their self-interest. I think the question becomes is that what is the form this self-interest takes, and at what point do the countries actually recognize that it's in their self-interest to take collective action and work together. I am also realistic that at the moment there are tensions. We do have blocks being formed where, whether it's around themes, whether it's around regions, countries are looking into how can they work together perhaps in smaller groups. And it can also actually lead to some efficiencies. I'm not saying it's an ideal world, but if we get countries, other stakeholders work together, form collective action around themes in regions, they can actually bring efficiencies. They can try to create markets where they get the solutions much more effectively to those that need them. So I do see hope.
So I think we should turn to Vamsi, because you're tracking who's spending what on clean energy. And what do you see? Can you give us a global overview? Who's investing the most in clean energy? Is it China?
When we think about energy transition, we are, the countries are trying to rewire from what has been the cheapest way to source their energy. And then now they're adding the additional ingredient of what is the lowest carbon way to do that. And we are seeing countries like China, where they don't have a lot of fossil resources other than coal, then transitioning to the rapid build out of solar and wind and battery storage. So I think as economics becomes clear, like that those sources are becoming cheaper and cheaper, the countries that are adding new capacity will find that those are the sources they want to add more and more.
We see the private sector investing a lot. The IRA is a great example of that. And there are similar initiatives in Europe and in Canada and in other countries. We see private investors also, they have the appetite around investing in green technologies. There is definitely private being private, they favor the investments that will bring higher returns. But this is where a public-private partnership will make sense to maybe de-risk some of those projects or provide incentives that can bridge the gap. But we see the money, absolutely. We start to see the money. Is it enough? It's not enough. So it needs to accelerate, it needs to go further. There are definitely a bigger role to play for the international funding entities.
Do you mean the World Bank and the IMF?
Exactly. To make sure that they're bridging between, or they're the bridge between the developing and the developed countries, so that the funding is going to the countries that need it most.
And Arnika, when you look at developing countries and the green transition, how much political will do you see there?
I think that the recognition is, as it is in the developed world, it is in the developing world, that being smarter with the resources that you have, being able to transition to clean energy, the benefits are enormous. When we look at the challenges that the developing world has, for example, with air pollution, and if we're able to transition to clean energy and ensure that the populations will actually benefit from renewables, it is the benefits are there for taking. And the good thing is that as the prices of these technologies are coming down, these are actually in the reach for the developing world as well.
Mark-Simon, you were talking a little bit about the need for clarity on carbon pricing. What do you feel really needs to be done?
We also need support from the governmental side, but also from the financing side as well, right? We need to have frameworks which are supporting then investments into green transition as well, to take off some of the risk which might be there, right? If you have larger projects not really hitting the criteria of, I say, maybe hedge funds or you name it, but to take off some risk and to make them much more attractive.
The investments that are currently being in place by the public sector is a great initial step, but there has to be more steps towards increasing the reach of those funds. So, for example, we have been running multiple cases to identify customers that the business case will pencil out for them. And it is penciling out for some regions, for example, in the US. But there are some regions where with the energy price is really low, it's not penciling out.
The renewable side of the equation is getting, there's still more dollars that needs to go in there. But I think that's pointing in the right direction. But to your point on the harder to abate sectors, like if you pick sustainable aviation fuel or green hydrogen and all of the likes there, it's still like very small. There's a lot of like technology that evolution that needs to happen. And the way I think about it is, look, there is the investment need, which is clear, how much investment needs to go into different areas. And then there is investment opportunities that a private investor or private sector is looking at. And there is a gap, right? Like that gap needs to be supported by clear, like long-term policy, which is where like something like an Inflation Reduction Act or what EU policy is coming in is trying to, while the technology scales and the cost curves come down, there is a need for like sort of long-term, like clear policy that companies can sort of like rely upon and pursue the projects.
Do you see China as being completely committed, Arnika, to the green transition? Do you see any wavering there?
Whenever you're attending a discussion on clean energy transition or green transition in the EU or US, the discussion always goes down to, but then the access to the resources, the critical materials. We're so dependent on China. This is going to kill it. We'll not be able to make it. Let's just stick to the past because we can't actually have access to those resources. And I think that it's essential that we stop going back to the past, start thinking innovatively. how is it that we actually react to these pressures, this challenge created by China? And here I think that we need much, much more discussion about how do we become much smarter with the resources that we have within our own borders. And here circular economy comes into the picture. And how do we actually keep the value of products and materials in the economy?
Mark, Simon, I have to ask you the final question, which is where is the money coming from?
As I mentioned at the beginning, we have demonstrated that profitability and sustainability are not mutually exclusive. We have reduced 27% of our emissions already by the end of last year. We helped our customers to reduce their emissions last year by 12 million tons of CO2. But yes, going forward, also that requires for us to make investments further to go down the line to become a 42% reduction in our emissions, and even long term, hopefully, to come to neutrality at some point in time, right? That needs innovation, that needs R&D, that needs investments. And hence, again, on a global scale, we need to ensure that we continue the dialogue and make sure that we have the right incentives.